1. The Ghost in the Ruins. Between 1851 and 1982, Singer produced over 100 million sewing machines. Today, the Elizabethport site remains under environmental remediation. The Singer name is currently owned by SVP Worldwide. The wind off the Arthur Kill is cold, but it's not the bite of the Jersey winter that makes me shiver. It's the silence. For a man who spent 40 years in the belly of the beast, silence feels like a physical weight, a pressure in the ears that shouldn't be there. I am standing on the edge of what used to be Elizabethport, 113 acres of industrial muscle that once dictated the rhythm of the world. In 2024, after the Great Fire tore through these remains, the site looks like a blackened ribcage of a fallen titan. But I don't see the charred timber or the twisted rebar. I see the industrial cathedral. I see the smoke from the foundry blotting out the sun, a permanent eclipse that signaled to the world that Singer was open for business. To understand the scale of what we lost, you have to understand what we were. We weren't just a company. We were an empire that didn't know how to retreat. By the time I walked into the Mahogany Row offices in the late 1940s, Singer was more than a brand. It was a global dialect. We held 90% of the market. Let that number sink in. 9 out of every 10 stitches made on this planet were governed by our patents. We were the first true multinational, a predator of the Victorian age that had grown so large it had its own internal railway, its own timber forests in Canada for the cabinet wood, and its own iron mines to feed the furnaces right here in Elizabeth. But standing here now, the air doesn't smell like the salt marshes or the modern city. It smells of sulfur. It's a deep, ancient smell, cooked into the very soil beneath my boots. It's the scent of a century of non-stop casting, of molten iron being poured into molds 24 hours a day. It's a smell that gets in your hair, your clothes, your pores, until you become a part of the machine itself. If I close my eyes, the ghosts start their shift. The silence is replaced by the dark symphony, a cacophony so loud it could rattle the fillings in your teeth. I hear the rhythmic thud hiss of the steam hammers and the high-pitched, agonizing scream of the metal planers. And beneath the mechanical roar, if you listen with a guilty conscience like mine, you hear the human cost. We called it the fortress. But for the thousands who poured through those gates at 6 a.m., it was a beautiful, terrifying grind. I remember walking the floor of the foundry as a young man, trying to keep my suit jacket from catching on the jagged edges of progress. I saw things then that we never put in the annual reports. I saw the crushed fingers, hands caught in the relentless timing of the drive belts because a worker was too tired to pull away in time. I saw 10-year-old boys, bobbin runners, and grease monkeys, small enough to crawl into the spaces between the massive, churning gears to clear a jam while the machines were still live. We didn't stop the line. To stop the line was to lose money. And at Singer, money was the only god we served. I can still see the fear in those children's eyes, their faces masked in a paste of coal dust and machine oil, looking like tiny, soot-covered ghosts before they were even old enough to live. We were arrogant. My God, were we arrogant. We sat in the boardroom at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, looking down at the world through gold-rimmed glasses, convinced that as long as people had clothes to mend, Singer would reign. We were the gold standard. We watched the Schwinn family in Chicago do the same thing with bicycles, dominating the market so completely that they forgot how to compete. We thought our history was a shield. We thought the fact that we had survived the Civil War and supplied the pistols that won World War II meant we were woven into the very fabric of time. But the truth is, the fortress of Elizabethport was built on a foundation of dirty laundry. We were born of Isaac Singer's scandals, a man who had more mistresses than patents, and Edward Clark's cold, legal ruthlessness. We invented the installment plan not to help the poor, but to chain them to our ledgers. We invented the trade-in and destroy program to systematically wipe out the used market, ensuring that the only way to get a Singer was to pay our price, on our terms. We were the architects of planned obsolescence before the term even had a name. I remember the peak. 40,000 workers worldwide. A city within a city. We had our own police force, our own infirmary, which was always busy, and a sense of permanence that felt like the pyramids. But even then, the rot was setting in. We were becoming sluggish, bloated, and stuck in the past. We were so busy celebrating our 100th anniversary that we didn't notice the lean, hungry engineers in Japan and Germany who were making machines that didn't need a mahogany cabinet to work. We dismissed them. "They're toys," we said in the boardroom, swirling our scotch. "Nobody wants a plastic machine. They want a singer." How wrong we were. Our arrogance turned the golden goose into a lead weight. As I walk deeper into the ruins, toward the spot where the great clock tower used to stand, the rumbling in my head grows louder. It's the sound of 1982, the sound of a heart stopping. On December 1st of that year, we didn't just close a factory, we killed a community. We walked away from Elizabethport, leaving behind a toxic graveyard of heavy metals and broken spirits. No severance that mattered, no retraining, just a thank you for 40 years. Don't let the gate hit you on the way out. I feel the weight of it now, the toxic legacy. It's not just the PCBs in the soil, it's the betrayal. We were the stewards of an American icon, and we gambled it away on aerospace fantasies and corporate diversifications we didn't understand, using the sewing machine as a cash cow until the poor beast was bled dry. We treated our workers like replaceable parts in a machine, forgetting that when the machine breaks, it's the people who are left in the cold. The fire of 2024 was just a late cremation for a corpse that had been rotting since the 82nds. But the ghosts, they don't leave. They are in the sulfurous air. They are in the screaming silence. They are in the memory of every child who lost a finger to a Singer gear, and every father who lost his dignity when we bolted the doors. Success is the most fragile thing in the world. We had it all, and we thought it was ours by divine right. These ruins stand as a warning to every invincible empire today. The market doesn't care about your heritage. It doesn't care about your logo. It only cares about what you're building today. We forgot that, and now, all I have left are the echoes of the dark symphony and the smell of sulfur on my hands. This is the story of the Singer Manufacturing Company. Not the one you read in the glossy brochures, but the one we whispered about in the hallways when the lights went low. It's a story of genius, greed, and a collapse that was as spectacular as our rise. Let me take you back to the beginning. Before the ruins, before the fire, back to a grimy workshop in Boston where a failed actor and a ruthless lawyer decided to stitch the world together and ended up tearing it apart. 2. The actor and the lawyer. The wind outside the ruins of Elizabethport may be cold, but the air in my memory is thick with the smell of grease paint and expensive gin. To understand why Singer fell, you have to understand the two men who birthed it. We were never a company founded on engineering alone. We were a creature born from the unholy marriage of a failed Shakespearean actor and a cold-blooded Wall Street lawyer. In the boardroom, we kept their portraits in heavy gold frames, but we never talked about the dirty laundry that stained the silk behind those frames. Isaac Merritt Singer and Edward Clark, the actor and the lawyer. If Isaac was the heart, pumping hot, erratic blood through the veins of the company, then Clark was the brain, calculating every drop of profit with the precision of a guillotine. Isaac Singer was a man of gargantuan appetites and a catastrophic lack of moral fiber. He didn't start out wanting to change the world of domestic labor. He wanted to be a star. He spent his youth wandering the country as a Shakespearean actor, a booming-voiced charlatan who loved the spotlight and women in equal, excessive measure. He was a failed dreamer with a trunk full of costumes and a trail of broken hearts and abandoned children behind him. When he finally tinkered with a sewing machine in that Boston workshop in 1850, he wasn't looking for a social revolution. He was looking for a way to fund his theater troupe. But Isaac had something the real engineers lacked, a performer's flair. He knew how to sell. He understood that a machine isn't just a collection of cams and shuttle hooks. It's a promise. He brought the drama of the stage to the grimy shop floor, but he also brought a personal life that would make a modern tabloid editor blush. While he was building the industrial cathedral, He was juggling multiple families, hiding mistresses in brownstones across New York, and fathering 24 children. The scandals didn't just hover over the company, they threatened to drown it. Every time Isaac was sued for bigamy or public indecency, the singer name took a hit. Enter Edward Clark. If Isaac was the fire, Clark was the ice. A graduate of Williams College, Clark was a man of severe manners and strategic ruthlessness. He saw the potential in Isaac's machine, but more importantly, he saw the potential in Isaac's chaos. He realized that the machine was brilliant, but the business model was broken. In the 1850s, a sewing machine cost $100, an astronomical sum when the average family earned pennies a day. Clark didn't lower the price. Instead, he invented the hire purchase plan. We call it the installment plan today. We take it for granted, this buy now, pay later culture. But in 1856, it was Clark's weapon of mass consumption. He realized that if he could hook a woman on the idea of the machine, he could chain her to the debt of the machine. It was a stroke of genius that turned the sewing machine from a luxury into a necessity. He didn't just sell a tool, he sold a debt. But Clark's ruthlessness didn't stop at consumer finance. He was the architect of the trade-in and destroy program. This is the part of our history they don't teach in business school. The dirty laundry we kept hidden in the basement files. Clark realized that a used Singer was his biggest competitor. If a woman could buy a second-hand machine for $20, she wouldn't buy a new one for $100. So, he instructed our agents to buy back old machines at a premium, and then we smashed them. I've seen the reports from that era. Thousands upon thousands of perfectly functional machines, iron marvels that could have lasted a century, are being hauled into the courtyards of our warehouses and pulverized with sledgehammers. We weren't recycling. We were murdering the competition. We were ensuring that the only way to participate in the modern world was to buy a brand new, shiny black and gold Singer. It was planned obsolescence at its most violent. The relationship between Isaac and Clark was a war of attrition. Clark hated Isaac's vulgarity. Isaac hated Clark's control. They couldn't stand to be in the same room, yet they were locked in a symbiotic embrace that created the wealthiest corporation on earth. Isaac's face was on the advertisements, the king of the sewing machine, while Clark was in the shadows, building the legal fortress that would protect our patents and crush anyone who dared to innovate. I remember reading the old correspondence between them while I was an executive in the 60 seconds. The vitriol was staggering. Clark spent half his time managing the company and the other half managing Isaac's legal disasters. When Isaac's multiple families finally collided in a public scandal that made the front pages of every newspaper in New York, Clark saw his chance. He forced Isaac into a voluntary exile in Europe. We paid the king to go away, to take his 24 children and his mistresses and his Shakespearean theatrics to a mansion in England, just so the Singer brand could pretend to be respectable. But here's the irony. The respectability Clark craved was built on the same ruthlessness he despised in Isaac. Under Clark's leadership, Singer became a predator. We didn't just win markets, we occupied them. We treated our sales agents like a paramilitary force. They were the men with the machines, trekking through the mud of rural America and the dust of colonial India, dragging these heavy iron beasts on their backs. And behind every salesman was Clark's legal team, ready to repossess the machine the moment a mother missed a payment. I used to look at the statue of Isaac Singer and wonder if he knew. Did he know that his theatrical invention would lead to the dark symphony I heard every day in Elizabethport? Did he care that the wealth he used to build his wigwam palace in England was extracted from the crushed fingers of the very people Clark was putting into debt? We were built on a lie. The lie was that we were a family company. We weren't. We were a machine designed to harvest wealth, engineered by a lawyer and fueled by the ego of an actor. I remember a night in the late 70 seconds, sitting in my office as the shadows grew long over the factory floor. I was looking at a first edition turtleback machine from 1856. It was a work of art, delicate, ornate, a testament to Isaac's flair. But as I touched the cold iron, I thought about Clark's ledgers. I thought about the thousands of machines we had smashed to keep the prices high. I thought about how we had inherited their arrogance. We thought we were smarter than the actor and the lawyer. We thought we could maintain the empire they built without the fire of the actor or the cold-blooded strategy of the lawyer. We had become sluggish, bloated, and stuck in the past. We were still using Clark's tactics in a world that had moved on to Japanese efficiency. We were still trying to trade in and destroy a market that was already abandoning us. Isaac Singer died in 1875, leaving behind a fortune of $13 million, an unthinkable sum, and a decades-long legal battle among his children. Clark lived longer, cementing the corporate structure that would eventually become the bloated beast I helped lead to the slaughter. They left us a toxic legacy long before the first PCB touched the soil of New Jersey. They left us with the belief that we were untouchable. They taught us that if you control the patents and the debt, you control the world. But they forgot one thing. An empire built on debt and destroyed competition has no soul. Standing here in 2024, looking at the charred remains of Clark's vision, I realized that the dirty laundry was never truly cleaned. It was just folded neatly and tucked away in the boardroom until the smell of rot became impossible to ignore. The actor gave us the mask. The lawyer gave us the teeth. Together, they gave us the world. And in the end, that was the very thing that destroyed us. 3. The 11-day miracle. The oil on my hands back in those days wasn't the clean, synthetic stuff we use now. It was heavy, whale oil-based, smelling of the sea and the slaughterhouse. Whenever I think of 1,850, I don't think of progress. I think of that suffocating heat in Orson Phelps's grimy machine shop in Boston. That is where the 11-day miracle happened. And it's where the soul of the company was forged in a fever of desperation. Isaac Singer didn't arrive in Boston to save the world's seamstresses. He was a man running away from his own failures. He had an idea for a wood-carving machine that no one wanted. And he was broke. Shakespearean actor sleeping on a bench broke. Phelps' shop was a graveyard of broken dreams, filled with the clunky, temperamental prototypes of Elias, Howe, and Leroux and Blodgett. Those early machines were a nightmare. They used a curved needle that moved horizontally, mimicking the human hand, and they constantly jammed. They were delicate toys that broke if you looked at them wrong. I remember reading the transcripts of Isaac's own account of those 11 days. He was a man possessed. He didn't have a formal education in mechanics, but he had the vision of a predator. He looked at the failing Leroux and Blodgett machine and saw the flaw that everyone else was too expert to notice. "Why move the needle like a hand?" he roared. "The hand is slow. The hand is weak." In 11 days, working by the flickering light of gas lamps, Isaac re-engineered the world. He ditched the curved needle for a straight, vertical one. He replaced the circular shuttle with a reciprocating one. And then, the stroke of genius that defined us. The foot pedal, the treadle. Before Isaac, you had to turn a hand crank. You were a slave to the machine's rhythm. With the treadle, for the first time in human history, the worker's hands were free to guide the fabric. When that prototype roared to life, it didn't just sew. It screamed. It hit 900 stitches per minute. To give you some perspective, a skilled seamstress could do maybe 40. In a single afternoon, Isaac Singer had created a universe of speed that made the human hand obsolete. It was a miracle, but like every miracle in our history, it was immediately baptized in blood and litigation. The 11-day miracle was followed by a decade of legal war. Elias Howe, who held the patent for the eye-pointed needle, sued us for everything we were worth. We were facing legal death before we even got off the ground. This is where the fortress of Singer really began. Not in a factory, but in a courtroom. We were being bled dry by lawyer fees. Isaac wanted to fight. He wanted to punch Howe in the face. But Edward Clark, ever the cold calculator, saw a different path. He orchestrated the Albany Agreement of 1856. It was the world's first patent pool. We sat down with our bitterest rivals, Wheeler and Wilson, Grover and Baker, and we made a pact. We stopped fighting each other and started fighting everyone else. We pooled our patents, charged a license fee to any small inventor who dared to try to enter the market, and used that money to build a war chest. We didn't just out-invent the competition. We legally strangled them. We created a walled garden where only the giants could survive. It was brilliant. It was ruthless. And it set the tone for the next century. We learned that you don't have to be the best if you own the rights to the air everyone else is breathing. But back on the shop floor, the miracle felt different. As a young executive, I used to visit the heritage museum we kept at the factory. I'd look at that first machine and feel a sense of awe. But then I'd think about the dark symphony that grew out of it. That 900 stitches per minute speed wasn't just a technical achievement. It was a pacing requirement. By increasing the speed of the stitch, we increased the speed of the human being. We turned mothers and daughters into extensions of the iron. I recall an old floor manager telling me about the early days in the sweatshops of New York, where our machines were first deployed. He spoke of women whose bodies became permanently warped, their right legs overdeveloped from the constant pumping of the treadle, their spines curved like the very needles Isaac had rejected. We called it industrialization. They called it the grind. The miracle in Boston gave us the power to clothe the world, but it also gave us the power to exploit it at a scale never before seen. We were so proud of that 900 stitch mark. We bragged about it in every catalog. We didn't mention that the speed often led to shattered needles, shrapnel that would fly into the eyes of the operators. I've seen the old medical logs from the Elizabethport infirmary, page after page of metal splinter in left eye, puncture wound through palm. We were sluggish, bloated, and stuck in the past in our later years. But in 1850, we were a lightning bolt. We were the disruptors of the 19th century. We took a craft that had remained unchanged since the dawn of civilization, the act of joining two pieces of fabric, and we mechanized it until it hummed with the vibration of pure profit. I remember standing in the ruins of the Boston site years later, before it was paved over. There was nothing left but the smell of old brick and damp earth. But if I closed my eyes, I could hear Isaac's voice booming over the clatter of the prototype. He was shouting at the shadows, demanding more speed, more power, more life. He got what he wanted. He got the 11-day miracle. He got the Albany Agreement that saved us from ruin. He got the empire. But as I look at the charred remains of our legacy today, I wonder if the miracle was actually a curse. We moved too fast. We innovated so hard and so ruthlessly in those first 11 days that we spent the next 100 years convinced we never had to do it again. We became arrogant, believing that the vertical needle and the foot treadle were the peak of human achievement. Like the Schwinns who believed the Stingray was the final word in bicycles, we believed the 1,850 design was our eternal shield. We rested on the laurels of a miracle that was a century old. We forgot that a miracle is only a miracle until someone else finds a better way. The 11-day miracle gave us the world, but it also gave us the toxic legacy of thinking we were gods. We thought we had conquered time itself with our 900 stitches per minute. But time is a patient creditor, and in 1982, it finally came to collect. The machines in Boston were loud, but the silence of Elizabethport in 2024 is louder. It's the sound of a miracle that finally ran out of steam. 4. The Fortress of Elizabethport. By 1872, the miracle had grown too large for the cramped workshops of Boston and the scattered assembly rooms of New York. We needed a place that matched our ego. We needed a fortress. I remember the first time I saw the site of the Elizabethport factory. Even decades later, as an executive looking at the sprawling, soot-stained maps in our boardroom, the scale of it felt impossible. We had claimed 113 acres of New Jersey marshland and turned it into an industrial cathedral. It wasn't just a factory. It was a statement of total, unassailable dominance. Standing there in the 1940s, at the peak of our power, you could feel the earth vibrate under your feet before you even entered the gates. This was the heart of the Singer Manufacturing Company. We didn't rely on the outside world. We had built a city within a city. We were a closed loop of industrial might. We had our own foundry that consumed mountains of iron ore, our own power plant that hissed with the pressure of 1,000 suns, and an internal railway system with locomotives that bore the Singer name, shuttling parts between buildings like red blood cells through a titan's veins. We were churning out 7,000 machines a week. Think about that. Every 7 days, enough iron was melted, enough needles were forged, and enough mahogany was polished to clothe a small nation. We were the gold standard of self-sufficiency. Like the Schwinns in their Chicago complex, we believed that if we owned every part of the process, from the timber forests in Canada to the cabinet shops in New Jersey, no one could ever touch us. But the fortress had a dark side. It was a masterpiece of efficiency, but it was also a monument to human endurance and human breaking points. I used to walk the long gallery, a corridor that seemed to stretch into infinity, flanked by rows of machines as far as the eye could see. The heat was the first thing that hit you. In the foundry, the temperatures were biblical. I remember seeing the pourers, men whose skin had been tanned to the color of old leather by the constant radiation of molten iron. They worked in a haze of metal dust that coated their lungs, a gray silt that they would cough up into their handkerchiefs at the end of a 12-hour shift. We executives called the factory a symphony of production, but for the workers, it was a dark symphony. The noise was so absolute it became a physical presence. You didn't hear it. You felt it in your marrow. It was a constant thud-grind scream that made conversation impossible. We developed a shorthand of hand signals, a silent language of the oppressed, used to communicate over the roar of the belts. And then there were the squeezed. That's what the older foreman called the accidents we didn't talk about in the stockholders' meetings. In a 113-acre complex, there are thousands of miles of leather drive belts, thousands of exposed gears, and thousands of opportunities for a moment of exhaustion to become a lifetime of regret. I recall an incident in '48. A young man, barely 20, who got his sleeve caught in a secondary drive shaft. The machine didn't feel his resistance. It didn't care about his crushed fingers or the way his arm was splintered like dry kindling. The line didn't stop until the blood caused the belt to slip. We hosed the floor. We replaced the belt. We kept the needles moving. That was the law of Elizabethport. The arrogance of the fortress was that we thought the walls worked both ways. We thought they kept the world out, but they actually kept us in. We became sluggish, bloated, and stuck in the past because we were too busy managing our own internal empire to notice the tectonic shifts in the global market. We were so proud that we made our own screws, our own needles, our own everything. We didn't realize that being self-sufficient meant we were also self-isolated. I remember sitting in the Great Tower, the administrative heart of the complex, looking out over the sea of sawtooth roofs. From up there, the workers looked like ants, tiny black specks moving between the brick canyons. It was easy to feel like a god from that height. It was easy to believe Edward Clarke's philosophy, that people were just another raw material to be processed, like iron or wood. We provided for them, in a way. We had an infirmary, a band, and a fire department. But it was all designed to keep the machine running. We viewed unions not as groups of people asking for dignity, but as threats to the machinery. We saw a strike the way a doctor sees a blood clot, something to be dissolved as quickly and ruthlessly as possible. We held the 1911 Clydebank strike in our minds as a cautionary tale. We wouldn't let that kind of disorder infect the fortress of Elizabethport. The fortress was designed to last 1,000 years. Its brickwork was thick enough to withstand a siege. Its chimneys were tall enough to carry our filth into the next county. We were singers. We were the empire of the needle. We watched other companies rise and fall, including the bicycle kings at Schwinn, and we smiled. We thought we had solved the problem of time. We thought that as long as we had the foundry and the railway and the 113 acres, we were immortal. But as I look back from the ruin of 2024, I see the fortress for what it really was, a beautiful, gilded cage. We had built a system so massive that it couldn't turn. We were a supertanker in an age of speedboats. The very self-sufficiency we bragged about became our toxic legacy. When the world moved toward lightweight alloys and electronics, we were still shackled to our foundries and our heavy iron castings. We were literally weighed down by our own greatness. I can still smell the sulfur and coal smoke when I close my eyes. It's a haunting scent, the smell of a century of unbridled ambition. I hear the rumbling of old machinery echoing in the hollows of my mind, a rhythmic ghost that tells me we were fools. We thought the walls of Elizabethport would protect us forever. We didn't understand that the fire wouldn't come from the outside. It would start in the boardroom, fed by our own arrogance and short-sightedness, until the fortress became a tomb. The 113-acre complex is gone now, mostly a memory of scorched earth and lawsuits over toxic graveyards. But the lesson remains. You can build a city within a city. You can control 90% of the world, and you can believe your name is written in stone. But the market doesn't care about your industrial cathedral. It only cares about how fast you can adapt. We didn't adapt. We sat in our fortress and waited for the world to come to us. And while we waited, the world found a different way to sow. 5. The Dark Symphony. The workers' reality. If the boardroom was the brain, and the Elizabethport fortress was the body, then the workers were the blood. And we bled them until they ran white. Whenever I walk through the silent, charred remains of the factory today, I don't hear the echoes of great men or the scratching of executive pens. I hear the Dark Symphony. It's a low, vibrating hum in the back of my skull, the sound of 5,000 souls trapped in a 12-hour loop of mechanical indifference. We have to talk about the brutal reality that the glossy Singer advertisements never showed. We showed the world a smiling housewife in a clean apron. We never showed the man in the foundry whose skin was the color of a bruised plum from the heat, or the child whose childhood was ground into the floorboards. I remember stepping onto the floor of the Elizabethport works in the heat of mid-July. You didn't just breathe the air, you chewed it. It was a thick, stagnant soup of metal dust, coal smoke, and the heavy, rancid smell of whale oil lubricants. It coated your throat like a layer of gray moss. We, executives, would walk the floor in our summer linens, handkerchiefs pressed to our noses, making strategic observations, while the men and women at the benches didn't even look up. They couldn't. At Singer, if you looked up, you lost a rhythm. If you lost a rhythm, you lost a finger. The safety standards of the time weren't just lax, they were non-existent. We viewed the worker as a replaceable component. If a needle bar snapped, you replaced it. If a worker's hand was mangled, you replaced him. I recall a specific morning in the assembly wing. There was a young girl, perhaps 14, though her papers said 18, whose hair got caught in the overhead line shafting. It happened in a heartbeat. The scream was drowned out by the roar of the belts. By the time they cut the power, she wasn't a girl anymore. She was a casualty of the universe of speed. We gave her family a week's wages and a sewing machine at a discount. That was our version of a settlement. But the most haunting part wasn't the sudden violence. It was the slow erosion. The Dark Symphony was a thief of time and health. The 12-hour shifts meant men went into the factory in the dark and came out in the dark. They were industrial ghosts, their lungs turned into sandpaper by the iron filings they inhaled every second of every day. We called it the Singer cough. It was a dry, hacking sound that punctuated the rhythm of the machines. We knew it was killing them. We just calculated that they would last long enough to meet the week's quota. And then there were the children. My God, the children. We were sluggish, bloated, and stuck in the past in our morals as much as our technology. Even as child labor laws began to tighten, we found ways to squeeze 10-year-old children into the gaps between the massive cast-iron gears. Their small frames were the only things that could reach the internal oiling ports without dismantling the entire line. They were grease monkeys in the truest, most tragic sense, slipping through the bowels of the machinery like rats, their tiny hands slick with the oil that kept our profits flowing. I still see them in my dreams, their eyes wide and glassy with terror, knowing that one slip of a foot on a greasy rung meant being crushed by the very empire that promised them a future. We treated unions like an infection. To us in the boardroom, a worker asking for a bathroom break or a living wage was a threat to the machinery. We looked at the 1,911 strike at our Clydebank factory in Scotland as the ultimate betrayal. 11,000 workers walked out because we tried to impose scientific management. a fancy term for making them work twice as fast for the same pay. We didn't negotiate, we broke them. We blacklisted them. We made sure that if you stood up for your dignity at Singer, you never worked in the industry again. We were the gold standard, and we didn't let the help tell us how to run our cathedral. Standing here in 2024, looking at the toxic graveyard we left behind, I realized that the poison wasn't just in the chemicals we dumped into the soil. It was in the way we viewed human beings. We were so arrogant that we thought we could sustain an empire on the backs of the broken. We ignored the simmering rage of the community. We took their labor, we took their health. And when the machines finally stopped in 1982, we took their hope, leaving them with nothing but crushed spirits and a landscape so polluted it would take a century to heal. I remember a man named Joe, a floor foreman who had been with us for 30 years. He had crushed fingers on his left hand from a mishap in the 50 seconds and a cough that sounded like a gravel pit. On the day we announced the closure, he didn't shout. He didn't throw a brick. He just sat on his workbench and cried, the tears carving clean tracks through the soot on his face. He had given his life to the Dark Symphony, and we were turning off the music without a second thought. We were like the Schwinns, who thought their workers were lucky to be part of the dynasty. We thought the Singer name was enough to keep them loyal while we bled them dry. We didn't realize that a factory without the respect of its workers is just a pile of bricks and iron waiting to fall. The rumbling of the old machinery still echoes in my mind, but now it doesn't sound like a symphony. It sounds like a funeral dirge. It's the sound of thousands of 12-hour shifts that lead to nowhere. It's the sound of the squeezed children and the Singer cough. We built the most successful company in the world, but we did it by forgetting that the machines were supposed to serve the people, not the other way around. We left a toxic legacy of broken bodies and a scorched earth. And as I stand in these ruins, the smell of sulfur reminds me that the fire was a long time coming. The Dark Symphony has finally reached its final, silent note, and all that's left is the outrage of the ghosts. 6. The machinery of death. The sewing machine is a delicate instrument of peace, a tool designed to create, to mend, and to bind families together. But the fortress of Elizabethport was a creature of iron and fire, and when the world went to war, the industrial cathedral didn't hesitate to trade its needles for daggers. We have to look at the machinery of death. This was the era where our arrogance was fueled by the ultimate high-stakes gamble, total mobilization. During World War I and especially World War II, Singer didn't just support the war effort. We became a primary engine of it. We pivoted our assembly lines with a cold, terrifying efficiency that only a monopoly could muster. The same hands that had spent decades adjusting the tension on a domestic Model 66 were suddenly machining the sliding bolts of 45 caliber M1911A, 1 pistols, and the intricate gearing of B-29 fire control computers. I remember the atmosphere in the boardroom during the early 40 seconds. There was a grim electricity in the air. We weren't talking about hem lengths or decorative stitching anymore. We were talking about kill ratios and muzzle velocities. We were awarded contracts for the most difficult, high-precision instruments of destruction because the War Department knew that if a machine could survive the Dark Symphony of our factories, it could survive the mud of Normandy or the humidity of Guadalcanal. We grew to a staggering peak of 40,000 workers. The Elizabethport complex ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, a relentless pulse that could be felt for miles. But this growth was a double-edged sword. While the government checks were pouring in and our profits reached heights that would have made even Edward Clark blush, we were hollowed out from the inside. We stopped innovating for the consumer. We stopped listening to the housewife. We became a war machine. And in doing so, we forgot how to be a sewing machine company. I recall walking through the Specialized Ordnance Wing in 1943. The smell of sulfur was different then. It was sharper, mixed with the acrid tang of gunpowder testing and the heavy chemical scent of industrial degreasers used on gun parts. The Dark Symphony had found a new, more lethal key. I watched those 10-year-old children, now teenagers, their faces hardened by the propaganda of the era, squeezed between the massive presses that stamped out shell casings. The urgency of the war gave us the perfect excuse to ignore every safety lesson we had ever pretended to learn. "It's for the boys overseas," the foreman would scream over the roar. If a worker lost a hand to a press making parts for a Browning machine gun, it was treated as a combat wound, a necessary sacrifice for the fortress of freedom. We were so proud of our 45 seconds. To this day, a Singer-made 1911 is the most coveted collector's item in the world of firearms. We only made 500 of them before we were moved to even more complex tasks, like the M5 and M6 directors for anti-aircraft guns. That was the height of our technical arrogance. We proved we could make anything. We believed we were the gold standard of American manufacturing, indispensable to the survival of Western civilization. But while we were winning the war, we were losing the peace. Like the Schwinns, who emerged from the war years convinced that their pre-war designs would satisfy a post-war world, we came back to the domestic market sluggish, bloated, and stuck in the past. We had spent years perfecting the machinery of death, and when the soldiers came home, we expected them to walk back into our showrooms and buy the same cast-iron monsters their grandmothers had used. We didn't realize that the world had changed. The war had taught the Japanese and the Germans how to manufacture with a lean, hungry precision that we had traded for sheer, government-subsidized bulk. I remember a meeting in 1946. We were looking at our production forecasts. One of the younger engineers, a man who had seen the efficiency of the Mitsubishi plants, suggested we look into lightweight aluminum alloys and streamlined electric motors. The senior executives laughed him out of the room. "We're Singer," they boomed, their voices echoing through the wood-paneled halls. "We made the computers that dropped the bombs. You think we need to worry about some toy machines from overseas?" That was the toxic legacy of our wartime success. It gave us a false sense of immortality. We mistook wartime volume for market health. We were so blinded by the machinery of death and the easy profits of the military-industrial complex that we didn't notice the golden goose was starting to choke on its own soot. The Elizabethport factory, our industrial cathedral, had become a fortress that refused to open its gates to the future. We had perfected the art of making 7,000 machines a week, but we had forgotten why we were making them. We viewed the sewing machine as a cash cow to be milked to fund our entry into the aerospace and defense industries, which we didn't understand, and where we were just another vendor, not the king. Standing in the ruins in 2024, I think about those pistols. I think about the aircraft components. I think about the thousands of tons of steel we moved through these halls to feed the hunger of a world at war. We were so efficient at killing, and so arrogant in our power, that we never saw our own execution coming. The rumbling of old machinery in my mind now sounds like the distant thunder of artillery. It's the sound of a company that lost its way in the smoke of the battlefield. We thought that by saving the world, we had earned the right to never change. But the market has no memory of your service. It only cares about what you're building today. We had built the most perfect machinery of death in the world. And in the end, it was the very thing that taught us how to die. We were the empire of the needle, but by 1945, the needle was already starting to break, and we were too busy celebrating our industrial cathedral to notice the cracks in the foundation. 7. The golden goose stops laying. The victory parades of 1945 were still echoing in the streets when the first cracks appeared in our industrial cathedral. But we were too drunk on our own greatness to hear them. We had saved the world, hadn't we? We had produced the pistols and the flight computers. We assumed the world owed us its patronage forever. Now, I have to tell you about the tragedy of the golden goose. For a century, the domestic sewing machine had been our lifeblood. It was the cash cow that funded our mansions, our dividends, and our global expansion. But in the late 1940s and throughout the 52nds, the goose stopped laying, and instead of checking the feed, we just started kicking the bird. The post-war era brought a terrifying new reality that we dismissed with a wave of a cigar. I remember a specific meeting in 1948 where a junior analyst brought in a machine he'd acquired from a trade show in Europe. It was a Necchi from Italy. It was beautiful, curvy, lightweight, finished in a soft matte green instead of our funereal black and gold. Most importantly, it did something our standard machines couldn't. It had a built-in zigzag stitch. No attachments, no clunky cams, just the turn of a dial. The room erupted in laughter. I can still hear the voices of the senior VPs, men who had been in the boardroom since the Hoover administration. "It looks like a kitchen appliance," one sneered. "Women don't want fancy stitches. They want a singer. They want a machine that weighs 40 pounds and lasts a lifetime." That was our death warrant, signed in ink of pure arrogance. We were sluggish, bloated, and stuck in the past. We were so convinced that the Singer name was an unassailable fortress that we ignored the fact that the fortress was built on 19th century technology. While we were resting on our laurels, the Japanese were rebuilding their industry from the ashes of the war. They didn't have 113 acres of legacy costs or a dark symphony of ancient steam hammers. They were lean, they were hungry, and they were listening to what women actually wanted. By the early 52nds, the Golden Goose wasn't just slowing down. She was being outpaced by a flock of newcomers. The Japanese machines, brands like Brother and Janome, started hitting the American shores. They were $30 cheaper than ours. They were lighter, and they came in colors that matched the modern, optimistic kitchens of the 1950s. Our response? We didn't innovate. We didn't streamline. Instead, we doubled down on the fortress mentality. We told our salesmen to work harder. We pushed the installment plans even more aggressively, trying to trap a new generation of housewives in the same debt cycles that Edward Clark had invented a century prior. But the 1950s housewife wasn't her grandmother. She had seen the world. She wanted the universe of speed and ease, not a piece of heavy Victorian furniture that required a mechanic to oil. I remember walking the floor of Elizabethport during this time. The rumbling of old machinery didn't sound like power anymore. It sounded like an old man gasping for air. The smell of sulfur and coal smoke, once the scent of progress, now felt like the smell of a stagnant pond. We were still casting heavy iron bodies when the rest of the world was moving to aluminum. We were still using manual milling when others were moving toward automation. We were exactly like the Schwinn family in Chicago. They looked at the mountain bike revolution and the lightweight European racers and said, "That's a fad. People want a heavy steel frame with the Schwinn name on it." They, like us, confused legacy with invincibility. We both believed that because we had survived the Great Depression, we were somehow immune to the laws of economics. As our market share began to bleed, a slow, agonizing drip at first, then a rushing torrent, the atmosphere in the boardroom shifted from arrogance to a panicked, cold calculation. We began to treat the sewing machine not as a product to be perfected, but as a cash cow to be bled dry. We diverted the profits that should have gone into research and development into diversification. We started buying companies that made calculators, flight simulators, and climate control systems. We were desperate to be modern, but we were doing it by abandoning the very thing that made us great. I recall a day in the mid-52nds when I visited the Clydebank factory. The workers there knew it before we did. You could see it in their eyes, the same eyes of the 10-year-old children from the past, now grown into weary men. They saw the Japanese machines in the shop windows and knew their 12-hour shifts were being outproduced by machines made across the sea. They asked us for better tools, for new designs. We gave them productivity quotas and threatened them with more blacklisting. We were a toxic legacy in the making. We were so busy trying to save the stock price that we forgot we were supposed to be making something people wanted to buy. We viewed our customers with the same arrogance we viewed our workers, as a captive audience that had no choice but to accept what we gave them. The most painful part was watching the trade-in and destroy program backfire. For a century, it had kept the market clean of used competitors. But now, people weren't trading in their old singers for new singers. They were trading them in for Janomes and Nekis. We were literally subsidizing our own replacement. I stood in the warehouse and watched a mountain of our own history being pulverized by sledgehammers. And for the first time, I felt a deep, cold shiver of dread. We weren't destroying the competition. We were destroying our soul. We had become the sluggish, bloated beast. Our internal railway was too slow, our foundry was too expensive, and our industrial cathedral was too big to heat. We were drowning in our own size. Like the silent factory in Greenville that Schwinn would eventually leave behind, Elizabethport was becoming a tombstone for a dream that refused to change. The smell of sulfur in my mind now is the smell of a fire that's been smothered but is still smoldering beneath the surface. The golden goose had stopped laying, and the eggs she had left were turning to stone. We were Singer, the #1 company in the world, and we were absolutely, fundamentally terrified. We were about to embark on the 1960s, a decade of aerospace fantasies and corporate panic. We were about to gamble everything on industries we didn't understand, using the sewing machine as the collateral for our own destruction. Standing in the ruins today, I can almost hear the dark symphony of the 50 seconds. It wasn't a song of triumph. It was the sound of a gear skipping a tooth. It was the sound of a needle hitting a plate and shattering into 1,000 pieces. We had the world in our hands, and we were letting it slip through our fingers because we were too proud to change the way we held it. Success is fragile. We forgot that, and the golden goose never laid another egg for us again. 8. The diversification gamble. The 1960s were a fever dream of chrome and hubris. While the rest of the world was looking at the moon, we were looking at the balance sheet of a dying god, and we were terrified of what we saw. We were no longer the empire of the needle. We had become a bloated, prehistoric beast trying to reinvent ourselves as a space-age pioneer. And in doing so, we committed the ultimate corporate sin. We used our heart to pay for our fantasies. In this moment, I have to confess the diversification gamble. By 1960, our market share wasn't just leaking, it was hemorrhaging. The golden goose was sick, and instead of finding a cure, the boardroom decided to buy a different kind of bird altogether. We looked at the sewing machine, the very thing that had built the industrial cathedral of Elizabethport, and we labeled it a cash cow. In corporate speak, that means you stop feeding it, stop grooming it, and milk it until its udders bleed so you can buy something sexier. I remember the day we acquired Frieden, a calculator and business machine company. The executives were giddy. They talked about synergy and the office of the future. We were buying into aerospace, flight simulators, and climate control. We were a sewing machine company that suddenly thought it could build the brains for missiles. We were chasing aerospace fantasies while our core customers, the women who had trusted the Singer name for a century, were being wooed by sleek, lightweight, plastic-bodied wonders from Japan that cost half as much and worked twice as well. The arrogance was breathtaking. We believed that the Singer logo was a magic wand that we could wave over any industry and conjure profits. We treated the sewing machine divisions like a neglected stepchild. I remember walking through the R&D labs in Elizabethport in 1965. The budget for new sewing technology had been slashed to the bone. Our engineers were brilliant, but they were being told to make it cheaper, not make it better. We started replacing the heavy, reliable steel gears, the ones that gave the Dark Symphony its resonant bass, with nylon and plastic. We were intentionally hollowing out the gold standard to save pennies, all while funneling millions into calculator companies that were about to be wiped out by the microchip revolution. We were making the same arrogant and short-sighted mistakes that the Schwinn family was making in Chicago. Just as Schwinn ignored the mountain bike because they were obsessed with their Stingray heritage, we ignored the electronic sewing revolution because we were obsessed with becoming a conglomerate. We both thought we were too big to fall. We both believed that our history was a substitute for a strategy. The atmosphere in the Elizabethport factory changed during the 60 seconds. The rumbling of old machinery started to sound like a death rattle. The workers weren't stupid. They saw the Frieden crates moving through the shipping docks. They saw the sluggish response from management whenever a machine line broke down. They knew the cash cow was being led to the slaughter. I remember a conversation with a veteran machinist, a man who had crushed fingers from the 1930s and a loyalty to the brand that was almost religious. "Sir," he said, holding up a new plastic tension dial that had snapped in his hand. "This isn't a Singer. This is a toy. If we don't care about the stitch, Why are we here? I didn't have an answer for him. I was part of the cold calculations of the boardroom. I was looking at the diversification charts, convincing myself that if we could just get a piece of the Apollo program, it wouldn't matter if we lost the housewives of Ohio. But the gamble failed. It failed because we didn't understand the industries we were buying into. We were sewing machine men trying to play in a world of high-frequency electronics and government defense contracts. We were outclassed, outmaneuvered, and out-innovated. By the late 1960s, our aerospace fantasies were costing us millions in losses, while our sewing machine market share had collapsed from its 90% peak to a mere fraction. We had created a toxic legacy of debt and distraction. Every dollar we spent on a failing calculator company was a dollar we didn't spend on an electronic sewing machine. By the time we realized that the toy machines from Japan were actually the future, we were too sluggish and bloated to catch up. We were a giant, trying to run a sprint while wearing a lead suit of our own making. I recall the board meetings of the late 60 seconds as a series of panicked retreats. The golden goose had been plucked bare. We started selling off pieces of the industrial cathedral just to keep the lights on. We were bleeding market share like a severed artery. And still, the arrogance remained. We refused to admit that our diversification was a disaster. We just looked for more cash cows to bleed. Standing in the ruins in 2024, I think about that machinist and his plastic dial. He was the ghost in the ruins, long before the fire. He saw the end coming when we decided that the Singer name was something to be exploited rather than earned. We had abandoned our roots for a seat at a table where we weren't welcome. Like the silent factory in Greenville that stood as a tombstone for an empire, Elizabethport was becoming a monument to our own stupidity. We had the resources, we had the talent, and we had the most recognizable brand in the world. But we chose pride over pragmatism. We chose the aerospace fantasy over the reality of the shop floor. The dark symphony of the 1960s was the sound of a company tearing itself apart. It was the sound of millions of dollars being thrown into a void, and the sound of 100 years of trust being eroded by plastic gears and boardroom ego. We were no longer the fortress of Elizabethport. We were a corporate corpse that hadn't realized it had stopped breathing. The 1970s were coming, and with them, the final bill for our gamble. The golden goose was dead, the cash cow was dry, and the machinery of death we had mastered in the 40 seconds was now being turned on ourselves. As the sun sets over the charred remains of the factory today, the smell of sulfur is a reminder of the burning of our capital and our conscience. We gambled with the lives of 40,000 workers to chase a dream of being something we weren't. And as any gambler will tell you, the house always wins. In this case, the house was a global market that had no room for a giant that refused to sow. 9. The final heartbeat. The heartbeat of a factory is a physical thing. It's a rhythmic, low-frequency pulse that settles in your marrow and stays there for 40 years. When it stops, the silence doesn't just arrive, it deafens you. I have to tell you about the day the lights went out on the industrial cathedral. But the death of Singer wasn't a sudden heart attack. It was a slow, agonizing bleed that began in 1975 and ended in a cold, metal-on-metal thud on the 1st of December 1982. We were the empire of the needle, but by the mid-70s, we were an empire of shadows, presiding over a toxic graveyard of our own making. The year 1975 was the first time the mask slipped. For the first time in over a century, the Singer Manufacturing Company reported a net loss, and it wasn't a small one. It was a staggering $450 million crater. In the boardroom at Rockefeller Plaza, the air tasted like ash. I remember the emergency meetings, the frantic shuffling of papers, the cold calculations that led us to realize our aerospace fantasies were worth nothing in a world that just wanted a reliable sewing machine. We had become sluggish, bloated, and stuck in the past, and the bill for our arrogance had finally come due. We did what every dying empire does. We started cannibalizing ourselves. We shut down the smaller plants first, but Elizabethport, the fortress, remained. It was too big to close, we thought. It was our identity, but the identity was a lie. By the late 70 seconds, The factory was a corporate corpse. We were only using a fraction of those 113 acres. The internal railway was rusting. The great foundry, where the Dark Symphony had been composed for 100 years, was cold and silent. The smell of sulfur was replaced by the damp, metallic scent of rot and stagnant water. I recall walking the floor in 1980. The brutal reality was unavoidable. The 40,000 workers we once boasted were gone, replaced by a skeleton crew of men with crushed spirits who knew they were just waiting for the executioner. We had stopped caring about the machines. We had stopped caring about the crushed fingers and the metal dust. We only cared about liquidity. The betrayal of the community is the part that burns the most. Elizabeth, New Jersey, was a singer town. Generations of families had given their lungs and their limbs to that factory. We had promised them a job for life, a slice of the American dream in exchange for their sweat. But when the end came, we didn't offer a handshake. We offered a locked gate. On the 1st of December 1982, the order finally came down. I was the one who had to oversee the final closure of the Elizabethport works. It was a Tuesday, I think. Gray, biting cold, the kind of New Jersey winter that settles in your bones. We didn't have a ceremony. We didn't have a final gold standard machine come off the line. We just turned off the breakers. I stood by the main gate as the men walked out for the last time. These were men like Joe, whose father and grandfather had worked these same floors. They carried their lunch pails and their toolboxes, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and a deep, simmering outrage. No severance pay could compensate for a century of loyalty. There was no retraining program. We just left them a toxic graveyard. We left 113 acres of soil saturated with lead, oil, and PCBs. We left a hollowed-out city that had built its entire economy around our needles. We were like the Schwinns in their final days, blind to the fact that when a giant falls, it crushes everything beneath it. Just as the Schwinn factory in Greenville became a tombstone for an empire, Elizabethport became a monument to our arrogance and short-sightedness. The rumbling of old machinery in my mind reached a crescendo that day, and then it just stopped. I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot long after the last worker had left. I looked up at the great clock tower, the one that had dictated the time for the entire city for generations. The hands were still moving, but they were ticking toward a future where Singer didn't exist. We had treated the sewing machine as a cash cow until it died of neglect, and now we were standing over the carcass with empty hands. We had become the sluggish, bloated beast that couldn't adapt. We had watched the Japanese lean manufacturing revolution from the windows of our industrial cathedral and dismissed it as a fad. We had ignored the 10-year-old children of our past and the loyal veterans of our present. We had chosen pride over pragmatism, and the market, in its unforgiving nature, had deleted us. The most haunting effect of that day wasn't the loss of the money. It was the loss of the soul. We had spent 130 years building a name that meant something, a name that was synonymous with quality and the American spirit. And in a single decade of cold calculations, we had turned that name into a corporate ping-pong ball to be batted around by liquidators and holding companies. Standing in the ruins in 2024, after the fire has finally finished what we started in 1982, I can still feel the final heartbeat. It's a phantom vibration, a memory of power that was lost because we forgot that an empire is only as strong as its foundation. We were the gold standard, but we were made of fool's gold. We left behind a toxic legacy, not just the chemicals in the dirt, but the bitter taste of betrayal in the mouths of thousands. We were singers. We were invincible, and on the 1st of December 1982, we proved that the only thing more dangerous than failing is believing you are too big to fall. The factory is a tombstone now. The machines are gone, sold for scrap or left to rust in the rain. The workers are gone, their stories fading into the soot. All that's left is the silence, and if you listen close enough, that silence is screaming the same warning that echoed through the empty halls of Schwinn. Adapt or die. Innovate or disappear. We chose to disappear. Des, a logo on a box. The empire didn't end with a bang or a final heroic stand. It ended with a lawyer's gavel and a liquidation sale. Standing here in the ruins of Elizabethport in 2024, looking at the charred remains of a century of ambition, I realize that the most painful part of the fall isn't the loss of the buildings. It's the realization that the name Singer has become nothing more than a ghost, a logo on a box, disconnected from the flesh, blood, and iron that gave it life. We have to look at the corporate ping-pong that followed our 1,982 collapse. It is a story of ghosts, of 1,999 bankruptcies, and of the hollowed-out remains of what we once called the gold standard. It is the final lesson for every invincible empire today, that once you lose your soul, the name on the box is just a mask for a corpse. By the late 1980s and early 92nd, the company was no longer a manufacturer. It was a financial instrument. We had sold off the Elizabethport factory, leaving behind that toxic graveyard of heavy metals and broken promises. The boardroom was no longer filled with men who knew the difference between a shuttle hook and a needle bar. It was filled with liquidators and corporate raiders, men who viewed our 130-year history as a series of assets to be stripped, sold, and traded. I watched from the sidelines, a retired ghost of the old guard, as the name was tossed back and forth across the globe. We went through a series of strategic restructurings that were really just polite terms for dying. In 1999, the inevitable finally happened. The Singer Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It was a $600 million collapse. The same company that had once controlled 90% of the world's market was now begging for scraps from creditors. We were drowning in debt, exactly like the Schwinn family when they watched their bicycle dream implode in the early 90s. The name was eventually snatched up by a holding company, merged with Husqvarna and Pfaff, and tucked away into a corporate portfolio. Today, if you go to a big box retailer or scroll through Amazon, you will see a machine with the Singer logo. It's white, it's light, it's made of injection molded plastic in a factory in Asia, where the workers have never heard of Elizabethport. It is a logo on a box, a hollow shell designed to trick the nostalgia of a generation that remembers their grandmother's industrial cathedral. Whenever I see one of those modern machines, I feel a pang of outrage and pity. I think of the dark symphony of the old days, the bone-shaking vibration of the cast iron, the weight of a machine that was built to last 3 lifetimes. Those old machines were forged in the sulfur and coal smoke of a world that took pride in its work. The new ones are designed for the landfill, built on the philosophy of disposable consumption that we helped create with our trade-in and destroy programs a century ago. The irony is as heavy as the iron we used to pour. We were the architects of our own obsolescence. We were so arrogant and short-sighted that we thought the Singer name was a shield against the future. We thought we could treat the sewing machine as a cash cow forever, bleeding it dry to fund aerospace fantasies that turned out to be nothing more than expensive smoke and mirrors. We were like the sluggish, bloated beast described in the Chronicles of Schwinn, a company that was too busy celebrating the past to notice that the future had already left us behind. I remember a few years ago, I saw an old Singer Model 221 featherweight in a thrift shop window. It was a machine from my era, the 1950s, black and gold, built with a precision that would make a watchmaker weep. I went inside and touched the cold metal, and for a second, the rumbling of old machinery echoed in my mind. I could almost hear the whistle of the Elizabethport train. But when I looked at the price tag, I realized the machine was worth more now than it was when it was new. People are desperate for that permanence, for the gold standard we discarded in our rush to become modern. We left a toxic legacy, and I don't just mean the PCBs in the New Jersey soil or the crushed fingers of the child laborers of the 1800s. We left the legacy of a corporate ping-pong world where nothing is built to last, where names are bought and sold like trading cards, and where the connection between the maker and the machine has been severed forever. Standing in the ruins in 2024, after the massive fire has licked the last of the grease from the bricks, I see the final lesson. The silent factory is a tombstone, but it is also a warning. It screams at every CEO who thinks their company is too big to fall. It whispers to every boardroom that chooses pride over pragmatism. It tells them that the market doesn't care about your industrial cathedral or your 130-year-old heritage. The market only cares about what you are building today. We forgot that. We let nostalgia cloud our judgment. We thought that because we were singers, we were immortal. The fire of 2024 was a mercy, in a way. It cleared the stage. The 113-acre complex is no longer a toxic graveyard of rotting wood and rusting steel. It is a blank slate of ash, but the ghost in the ruins remains. I am that ghost. I am the man who saw the first .45 caliber pistol come off the line in 42 and the last door lock in 82. I carry the dirty laundry of Isaac Singer and the cold calculations of Edward Clark in my head, and I can tell you that the cost of our greatness was too high. We won the world, and we deserved to lose it. We built a universe of speed that eventually outran us. We created a dark symphony that eventually deafened us to the needs of our customers. And in the end, we became exactly what we feared. A corporate corpse, sold off in pieces to pay creditors. As I turn away from the ruins of Elizabethport for the last time, the smell of sulfur is finally fading, replaced by the scent of rain and wet ash. The final heartbeat is silent. There is no more rumbling. There is only the wind. If you own an old Singer, one of the heavy ones, the ones that require 2 people to lift, keep it, oil it. Listen to the rhythm of the stitch, because that machine is the only thing left of the empire. Everything else, the factories, the foundries, the 40,000 workers, the fortress of Elizabethport, is gone. It has been reduced to a logo on a box, a ghost of an American dream that refused to change until it was too late. The silent factory doesn't just represent Singer's failure. It represents the fatal cost of ignoring change. We were the kings of the world, and now we are just a warning. Adapt or die. Innovate or disappear. We disappeared, and the ruins still stand, scorched, silent, and empty, as a monument to our own arrogance and short-sightedness. The dream is gone. All that's left is the silence. And if you listen close enough, that silence is screaming a warning to every business leader alive. Success is fragile. The ruins are waiting.